In the year 1603, a merchant named Yamamoto Seizamon sat in his counting house in Osaka and divided his morning's earnings into 7 ceramic jars before he allowed himself to eat breakfast. This was not ritual for the sake of ritual. This was not superstition dressed in the clothing of discipline. This was a decision architecture so precisely constructed that it removed the most dangerous element from financial management entirely. That element was the feeling of having money available. 3 centuries later, the average American man approaching retirement opens a banking app on his phone and sees a single number. Everything he has earned, everything he has saved, everything he has not yet spent, compressed into one figure that fluctuates daily, sometimes hourly, in response to forces he cannot see and did not choose. His financial advisor tells him to diversify. His broker tells him to stay the course. His neighbor tells him about a stock that moved 30% last quarter. And somewhere beneath all of this noise, a quiet and persistent sense remains that something fundamental is missing. Not a product, not an account type, not a new strategy. Something older than all of it. Something that was understood by men sitting in counting houses in Osaka 400 years ago and has not been clearly articulated in Western financial culture since. If you have ever felt that, you were not wrong. The absence is real, and it has a name, a history, and a practice that we are going to examine tonight with the patience that this kind of knowledge deserves. What strikes me most, after decades of studying both Japanese and Western financial traditions, is not that the Japanese developed better instruments or superior mathematics. They did not. What strikes me is that they asked a fundamentally different question. Western financial tradition, from the Amsterdam exchanges of the 1600s to the brokerage accounts of today, has always asked, how do I grow this money? The Japanese merchant tradition asked something quieter and ultimately more powerful. How do I ensure that this money serves its correct purpose without interference from the wanting mind? These are not the same question, and the difference between them explains everything. The Edo period began in 1603 when Tokugawa Ieyasu completed his military unification of Japan and established his shogunate in the city that would become Tokyo. For the first time in more than a century, Japan was at peace. And peace, for the merchant class, created a problem that prosperity always creates. They suddenly had more than they needed for immediate survival, and they had no inherited wisdom for managing surplus. The samurai class had their own relationship with money, one governed by the Bushido code that treated open concern with finances as beneath the dignity of a warrior. But this was not the same as carelessness. The samurai households managed their stipends, called koku and measured in rice, with extraordinary precision. They simply did not speak of this management openly. The discipline was invisible by design. It was embedded in household structure rather than articulated in conversation. A samurai who ran out of his stipend before the season's end did not go to his lord and ask for more. He reduced his household expenses to match what remained. Silently, without complaint, the code demanded it. The great merchant families of Osaka, the trading city that the Japanese still call the kitchen of the nation, watched this samurai discipline with deep interest. Families like the Konoike, the Mitsui, and the Sumitomo were accumulating wealth at a pace that Japan had never seen before. The Konoike family, originally sack brewers from the town of Konoike in Setsu province, had diversified into money changing and lending by the early 1600s and would eventually become the primary financiers of the Tokugawa government itself. By 1620, Konoike Shinroku, the family patriarch who is credited with establishing many of the household financial practices that would be codified over the following generations, had identified the central danger facing merchant families of his era. It was not market risk, it was not political instability, though that was real enough. It was the fundamental human difficulty of maintaining financial discipline across multiple generations, across sons who had never experienced scarcity, across daughters-in-law who brought different household assumptions, across apprentices who saw the family's wealth and drew incorrect conclusions about its availability. Konoike Shinroku's solution was structural. He codified what had likely existed as informal practice in some merchant households into a named system with defined rules, defined proportions, and defined rituals of accountability. The system he formalized is what we now call takawari, from take, meaning bamboo, and wari, meaning to divide or to split. The name itself carries meaning. Bamboo is not divided arbitrarily. Each section between the knots is a distinct chamber, naturally sealed, capable of holding liquid independently of the others. To divide like bamboo is to create natural, structural separation that holds without requiring constant human enforcement. In household practice, the system was more commonly referred to as kameoki, the jar system, because of the physical ceramic vessels used to implement it. These were not decorative, they were functional, often plain, each marked with a single character identifying its purpose. The character was painted by the household head himself, a deliberate act that invested the vessel with a kind of authority beyond mere clay. The Konoike household records, some of which survive in archives accessible to Japanese scholars today, indicate a division into 7 categories. The first was yane, meaning roof, which contained the resources for maintaining the household as a stable physical structure. This was not merely rent or mortgage. It encompassed all that kept the family unit intact as a social entity, including the maintenance of relationships that protected the household from external threats. The second was tain, meaning seed, the category most critical to the system's long-term power. Tain was money that would be planted and not touched, not for 1 year, not for 5 years. The Konoike family rule, as recorded in their household teachings, was that tane could only be accessed after a period of no less than 10 years, and only by unanimous decision of the family council. The third jar was nagare, meaning flow or current, designated for the ongoing expenses of daily commerce and household operations. The fourth was gimu, meaning obligation, set aside exclusively for debts, commitments, and promises that had already been made to other parties. The fifth was senzo, meaning ancestors, reserved for the maintenance of family graves, temple relationships, and the regular rituals that connected the living household to those who had come before. The sixth was kodomo, meaning children, held separately for the education, apprenticeship, and eventual establishment of the next generation in their own households. And the seventh was tanashimi, meaning enjoyment or pleasure, the smallest jar, the only one from which money could be freely spent without requiring justification or accounting. Each time revenue entered the household, it was physically divided among these 7 jars according to proportions that had been set by the household patriarch, recorded in the family's account books, and treated as essentially fixed for the duration of his tenure. The proportions themselves varied by family wealth and circumstance. A family in its early years of accumulation might place 40% in tain and live with modest allocations to nagare and tanashimi. A family that had achieved stability across 3 generations might reduce tain to 20% and allow more generous flow to kodomo. But the act of division itself was non-negotiable. The proportions were applied before a single mon was spent, before the morning meal, before any vendor was paid, before any pleasure was considered. This sequencing was not incidental. It was the entire mechanism of the system's power. The principle that animated takawari can be expressed in 3 words that were passed down orally within merchant households across the Edo period: wakete, hete, nokosu. Separate, reduce, preserve. This sequence represents a complete inversion of the natural human relationship with incoming resources. The untrained mind, encountering money, experiences it first as a totality. I have this much. From that totality, it subtracts obligations, then desires, and then attempts to preserve whatever remains. This is the sequence that creates the experience of money always being insufficient. Because desire, operating on a felt totality, will nearly always consume the margin that was intended for preservation. Wakete, hite, nokosu destroys this sequence at its origin. Separation happens before the totality can be felt as available. The moment money enters the household, it is no longer one amount. It is 7 amounts, each owned by its jar and its named purpose. The mind cannot attach to the total because the total does not exist as a single, accessible entity for more than the few moments it takes to perform the division. What the mind experiences as available is only nagare and tanashimi, and these are inherently bounded. There is a Japanese proverb that the OSAKA merchants kept in household teaching texts: Kinsen, wa wakareba kieru, matomereba nokoru. Money separated disappears. Money concentrated remains. This sounds backward until you understand exactly what kind of disappearing is intended. Money separated into purpose-defined vessels disappears from the realm of the wanting mind. It becomes inaccessible not through external lock and key, but through named identity. The tain jar is not a pile of coins. It is seed. To take money from seed to satisfy a daily expense is not a financial transaction. It is a category violation. It requires the mind to consciously perform an act of category violation, and the physical presence of the jar, with its painted character, makes this psychological friction tangible and real. This is the psychological genius of Takawari that no modern financial product has successfully replicated. Modern accounts are designed for access. They are designed to reduce friction. Every improvement in banking technology for the last century has been aimed at making money easier to reach, easier to move, easier to spend. The ceramic jar moves in the exact opposite direction. It creates friction by design. It makes the violation of a financial boundary require a physical, conscious, witnessed act. You must pick up the jar. You must see the character. You must reach inside. And in a household where the patriarch's system was visible to the entire family, this act could not be performed invisibly. The Sumitomo family, whose origins were in copper, smelting, and trading, added their own refinement to this framework in the mid-Edo period. They introduced what their household records call kakurenbo-kin, hidden money, a reserve that existed entirely outside the visible jar system and was known only to the household head and his designated successor. The amount maintained in kakurenbo-kin was governed by a principle the Sumitomo called sanin no kome, 3 years of rice, meaning that the hidden reserve should at all times be sufficient to maintain the household's basic survival for a minimum of 3 years without any income whatsoever. This was not emergency fund in any modern sense of the phrase. It was catastrophe reserve. The merchant families of Edo had studied the history of their city and their country carefully. They knew that fires swept through urban districts with terrifying regularity. They knew that political decisions made in the shogun's court could eliminate a family's commercial privileges overnight. They knew that illness could take a patriarch in a single season. Sanin no kome was not preparation for inconvenience. It was preparation for the complete collapse of the household's visible financial structure. And it was maintained invisibly so that creditors, competitors, and even government officials had no knowledge of its existence. The Mitsui family, whose household financial teachings were codified in the Mitsui Kakun, a set of family precepts that are among the most studied merchant documents of the Edo period, formalized another element that completes the philosophical picture of Takawari. They described money as having 2 distinct natures, which they called ugoku kane, moving money, and nemuru kane, sleeping money. Moving money was nagare, the flow of daily commerce. Sleeping money was tane and kakurenbo-kin. The Mitsui teaching was explicit. The health of a household was determined not by the size of its moving money, but by the depth of its sleeping money. Moving money created the impression of prosperity. Sleeping money created the reality of security. This distinction, simple as it sounds, represents an entirely different philosophy of wealth than the one that dominates Western financial culture. Western culture, from its earliest commercial traditions through to the present day, has treated money primarily in its moving state. Money in motion earns returns. Money in motion demonstrates activity. Money sitting still is money wasted. The Japanese merchant tradition understood something that this philosophy consistently misses. Money sitting still, purposefully and deliberately still, develops a kind of structural weight that protects the household in ways that no return on investment can replicate. The question of why this system never crossed cultural boundaries to establish itself in Western financial tradition is one that deserves careful consideration rather than simple answers. The easy response would be to suggest that Western merchants simply did not know about Japanese practices. But this explanation is insufficient. Knowledge of Japanese commercial culture was available to European traders as early as the late 1500s through the Portuguese and Dutch trading relationships with Japan. The real barriers were deeper, and they were structural. The first barrier was the difference in what constituted the basic unit of economic life. In Western commercial tradition, and especially in American financial culture as it developed through the 18th and 19th centuries, the individual was sovereign. Your money was your money. Your decisions were your prerogative. Your retirement was your personal responsibility to plan and execute. This orientation generated enormous productive energy. It created the conditions for individual initiative and entrepreneurial ambition, but it also created a structural gap in intergenerational thinking. If each individual is financially sovereign, there is no natural mechanism for the transmission of financial practice across generations. Each generation essentially begins again, reinventing its relationship with money from personal experience and whatever cultural messages happen to be dominant in its moment. The Edo merchant families operated from the opposite assumption. The household was the fundamental unit, not the individual. Money that entered the household was not owned by the current patriarch. He was its steward for his generation. The jars contained money that belonged simultaneously to the ancestors who had accumulated it, to the living family members who depended on it, and to the descendants who would inherit it. This understanding made the proportions of Takewari feel not like arbitrary self-imposed rules, but like sacred obligations to people who existed across time. Violating the Tain jar was not a personal financial decision. It was a betrayal of both the past and the future. No American financial product has ever created this feeling, and none can, because the feeling arises not from the product, but from the belief system within which the product operates. The second barrier was the role of visible wealth in social signaling. American culture developed in a context where displaying prosperity was functionally important. In a highly mobile society without fixed hereditary class structures, external presentation was one of the primary means by which individuals communicated their reliability, their creditworthiness, and their social standing. The merchant who appeared prosperous attracted investment. The family that displayed fine possessions signaled that it was a safe alliance. This was not mere vanity. It was rational strategy within the specific conditions of American social development. The Edo merchants operated under legally enforced constraints on visible display. The Tokugawa sumptuary laws restricted what members of each social class could wear, what materials their homes could display, what foods could appear at their celebrations. A merchant who displayed wealth that exceeded his designated social station risked attracting the attention of samurai authorities, for whom the sight of a merchant living more grandly than a warrior was both an affront and an opportunity. The rational strategy for the Osaka merchant was therefore invisibility. The grandest fortunes were kept behind deliberately modest facades. The jars were stored in inner rooms. Prosperity was understood and practiced as an internal condition rather than an external display. When external display is rewarded, money flows toward the surface. When external display is dangerous, money flows toward depth. These are opposite gravitational forces, and they create opposite financial cultures over time. Neither culture made a conscious choice to embrace or reject the other's wisdom. They each responded rationally to the incentive structures of their specific environments. But the result is that Western financial culture developed without the specific practice of purposeful separation and without the philosophical framework that makes that practice feel not like deprivation, but like dignity. The third barrier was transmission. Takwari was not recorded in books intended for public distribution. It was not taught in schools or institutions. It was practiced in households and transmitted from parent to child in the context of daily life, in the physical presence of the jars, in the seasonal rhythms of fushime, the formal quarterly review of all vessels that allowed the family to calibrate without crisis. When Japanese families emigrated to America and entered the American educational and economic system, most of these household practices did not survive the transition. The grandchildren of Osaka merchants became American professionals, educated in American assumptions, absorbing American financial instincts. The jars remained in Japan. And eventually, with the rapid modernization of the post-war period, many families in Japan itself moved their banking to institutions and left the ceramic vessels empty. What persisted was not the specific method, but the underlying disposition. Japanese household savings rates have consistently exceeded American household savings rates across every decade of the post-war period, even when controlling for income differentials and economic conditions. Something in the cultural transmission preserved the instinct even after the physical method was lost. But instinct without method is difficult to sustain across a lifetime and nearly impossible to transmit to the next generation. The method can be recovered, not identically. The ceramic jars belong to their era, but the principles they embodied are fully translatable into the conditions of contemporary American life, and they require no dramatic transformation of existing habits. They require only a restructuring of the sequence in which financial decisions are made. Begin with the separation before anything else. Open dedicated accounts, not one account, not two, but accounts designated by purpose and named for those purposes. One account is tain, your seed. It receives a fixed percentage of every dollar that enters your financial life before any other allocation is made. Determine this percentage in advance, during a calm moment, not in the presence of incoming money. Write it down. Set it as an automatic transfer that executes on the day income arrives. The number does not need to be large to begin. 10% is sufficient. What matters is that the transfer is automatic, which means the money is separated before your attention can attach to it as a whole. Create friction for your tain account that is deliberately inconvenient. Remove it from your primary banking application. Do not memorize its account number. Do not carry its access card. If withdrawing from it requires you to log into a separate institution, request a transfer and wait several business days. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. The friction is the mechanism. It is the psychological equivalent of the painted jar in the inner room. Institute your own fushime on a quarterly schedule. Choose 4 dates per year, perhaps aligned with the first weeks of January, April, July, and October. On these dates, review every account, record the balances. Note any moments in the previous quarter when money was moved from one purpose to another without the intention that governed the original designation. Do not judge this harshly. The fushime was never a tribunal. It was a calibration. Its purpose was to see clearly and adjust forward, not to assign blame for the past. After the review, make one small adjustment if adjustment is needed. 1. Not a complete restructuring. Kaizen, the principle of continuous improvement through small deliberate steps, applies here as directly as it applies to any other domain of life. Finally, begin the long construction of your Sanin no Kome. This is a separate reserve, held in an account that does not appear in your regular financial review, governed by a single rule. It is not accessible except in the case of the kind of catastrophe that the Osaka merchants prepared for, not a market downturn, not an unexpected expense. The kind of event after which the visible structure of your financial life would need to be rebuilt from the ground. This reserve takes years to establish. It is meant to take years. The patience required to build it is itself part of its function. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives when a man names what has been missing. Not the answer to a problem exactly, but the recognition that the problem was real, that his instinct was accurate, and that the answer has existed somewhere in the world, even if it had not yet reached him. You may have spent years sensing that the way Americans are taught to manage money lacks something essential. You may have wondered why the most disciplined culture you admire, a culture that gave the world the precision of the tea ceremony, the patience of the Zen garden, the endurance of the samurai across centuries of upheaval, would have anything different to offer about money than what appears in mainstream financial advice. The wondering was correct. The ceramic jars of the Osaka merchants were not primitive technology waiting to be replaced by superior instruments. They were a philosophy made physical. They were a belief about the nature of money, the nature of time, and the nature of human psychology translated into daily practice. The jars said, "You cannot trust the wanting mind to make good decisions about the whole. So give the wanting mind only what it is meant to receive, and protect the rest through structure rather than through willpower alone." You are not at the beginning of your financial life. You are at the point where clarity matters more than acceleration, where structure matters more than strategy, where peace of mind about the future matters more than the next quarter's return. The Takawari system was not designed for young men accumulating. It was designed for households maintaining, for families that understood the difference between a single season of prosperity and a structure that could hold across generations. In our next conversation, we will look at another principle that the great merchant families preserved alongside Takawari, one that governed not the division of incoming money, but the philosophy of inheritance and transition. The Japanese called it inkyo, the art of deliberate stepping back, and it may explain why some family fortunes grow more powerful after the founder is gone, while others dissolve within a single generation of his passing. Until then, consider what you would name your jars. Consider what purposes, spoken honestly rather than optimistically, would claim their proportions. The answer will tell you something true about where you are and what the structure of your remaining years is meant to protect. The jars are patient. They will wait for you to fill them.